All right. Hello, everybody, and welcome to our second episode of Wired for STEM. I'm Tim Conlin. I lead marketing and innovation for Snap Circuits. And today, really excited, we're going to be talking about the power of play, the power of mistakes, and the power of failure, all in enhancing STEM learning with students. And I'm really excited because today we have just an amazing human being. We have Dr. Amy joining us, and Dr. Amy is very experienced. She has 16 years working with K through 8 students and teacher educators, helping both kids and adults really rethink and explore what it truly means to learn in virtual and in-person settings. And for the past 8 years, she's been an incredible advocate for STEM and play-based learning, really bringing kids back to the center of the learning experience. And her work has been focused on creating these conscious approaches to learning that really honor curiosity and an understanding of the power of mistakes and celebrates this whole messy process of STEM discovery. She believes that play and exploration are essential to helping kids build these critical thinking skills and really develop a healthy relationship with failure as part of a natural learning. So, Amy, I'm so excited. Thank you for taking the time and thanks for joining us today.
Thank you so much for having me.
Fantastic. I'd like just to kick off with tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, and what drew you into this space. And
Yeah, for sure. Well, actually, my journey actually started a while ago with Snap Circuits. I bought a secondhand set when I was a K-8 instructor and I absolutely fell in love. So to be on this
really,
podcast is such an honor. But yeah, I am a previous K-8 teacher. And I was first involved with STEM. So my undergrad is in math and science education. So I was teaching those, and I was involved with a local grant that involved teachers teaching STEM. And so there were faculty members that came into our classroom, helped us implement STEM engineering design, helped us with aligning it to curriculum. And I saw my classroom light up. And as a science teacher, when you have a good science experiment, you're like, oh my gosh, my classroom is alive, it's buzzing, it's chaotic. That is what happened with STEM. And so as I started implementing that into my math classroom, I saw that same energy come into my classroom. And so I was like, okay, I need to know everything I can about this because it truly was an experience that I stepped back. I wasn't necessarily teaching, I was more of a guide and a facilitator, and the kids just took over. And so it was almost addicting in a way just to see kids that had previously not been involved in class get excited about learning. And so I pursued my PhD and now I've worked, across the state with different teachers. I've had the privilege of working with co-ops and nonprofits, just learning how we can get kids back into the center of the learning experience. So that's a little bit about me.
yeah, that's fantastic. That's really great. And I love your energy and I love your journey. Right? It's fantastic to hear about. And I'm always fascinated to hear the journey of educators and whether
Mhm.
they're teaching students, they're teaching teachers. It's just fascinating. And
Yeah.
I want to start off our discussion today with
Mhm.
really talking about the role of making mistakes or the role of failure in STEM. It's such a tough word sometimes, oh, failure, but it can be such a key part of the process. And I'd love just your thoughts. Just start off. What comes to mind when we talk about the role
Mhm.
of failure or making mistakes in STEM?
Well, I can speak from my experience, and it is truly the foundation of learning. And when you think of, oh, I'm going to make a mistake, a lot of people may think of, resiliency in learning. That's a really important skill to have. However, it's so much more than that because when you fail, you have to problem solve. You have to think creatively. You have to think critically. And so it's all of these, what have previously been determined by education as soft skills, really become the foundation because it's less about what they're learning and learning how to learn. And so they're using these skills to build future learner skills for, learning different math and science or engineering concepts. And so it truly is the foundation of it, but it can be so scary for students and teachers and myself to fail, right? And so in our society, a term that I like to use is we like error less. We like mistake less learning. I don't want to screw up on this podcast, right? Because,
Yeah.
that would be tied to embarrassment. It would be tied to being ashamed of myself. And so there's this stigma that, making an error feels less than it. And in school, it's often penalized. And so you get a decreased grade, you have to redo homework. And, you know, while it's well meaning, it has some implications of how powerful mistakes can actually be. And so when we talk about STEM and the role of failing, it really has to be a shift in how we approach it and in conversations and even just our mindset as teachers, that we're constantly rewiring how we think of mistakes. So, to your point, it's foundational. It's super important to this idea of what STEM is.
Yeah, it's amazing. It's such a powerful tool, and at any age, right? This idea
Hmm.
of being a little vulnerable and being not afraid to make mistakes is so important
Hmm.
to development throughout.
Hmm.
Completely agree. Do you think that failure's role or making mistakes has been overlooked? And if so, why do you think? And you talked a little bit about the cultural impact, but from an educator or teacher standpoint.
Yeah. So there's actually some really cool research that has been coming out in the last few years just with this idea of this mistakeless learning that a lot of people have moved towards. Like we want efficiency with learning. We're always trying to find the next hack or the next toy and trying to figure out what makes learning quicker and more efficient for everyone. And this research that has been coming out is actually slowing down and going backwards from the traditional sense of learning in that you make errors on purpose. And some of the research that's coming out is stating that having kids make an error on purpose and then reworking it is more efficient than reteaching. And so it's this whole idea of we're trying to get to kids not passing tests. We're trying to go for deep lifelong learning here. And so, if we want that deep lifelong learning, we have to start building those connections and learning. And so, going back and making mistakes or providing experiences to make mistakes all hinges on the ability to be able to make a mistake, see it as failure, and then move forward with that. And, we all have different nervous system reactions to it. You could shut down, you could get really frustrated, or you could barrel through and say, I'm going to get this for sure. But all the while, this really important conversation of what are mistakes, how do they fit into learning, can be a really powerful conversation, both with teachers and with students. And so having them understand, like, this is important, we need to talk about this and kind of understand the whole process of learning rather than just learning math or just learning science or just learning technology.
Yep. Yep. And you've been doing this a long time. Can you talk a little bit about how students typically respond to failure? Has it evolved? Has it changed? And do you see it continuing to evolve?
That's an interesting question because when I first started implementing STEM experiences in my classroom, I was really shocked by the response. I was like, well, this is really fun. Kids are going to like this. So, therefore, they're just going to enjoy the whole process. And that was not the case. And as I started doing this, I started realizing one, I was not okay with failure. As a teacher, I didn't like when a lesson failed. So, that was something that I had to challenge with myself. But then, two, I realized that it was a skill that we needed to foster in kids. This whole idea of, soft skills of problem solving, I think right along that, it needs to be how to fail and how to understand the importance of it and move forward with it. And so it was something that as I continued to iterate in my classroom, I had to almost like scaffold the failures. And so I would start with a bell ringer. And so it was like stacking cards, see how high you could get the tower. And so failure felt less scary in that scenario. And then gradually throughout the school year, we would move into more complex, standard aligned experiences that, were tied to a grade. And yet they had that experience of, okay, this is, experiences that are failing and I can do this. And so it was very interesting to me on that topic that I had the privilege of doing this kindergarten all the way up to college level. And the kindergartners, I had this idea of they're going to come in and not really have any idea of this. And yet they were the ones that were the most creative, the most problem solving. And now I have a preschooler. And if you've ever talked to a preschooler, you know how creative they are. And they just are so resilient by nature. And so it's really given me a pause of, okay, so this is really something we need to be cultivating in every school setting is this idea of, your creative ideas matter, your problem solvings matter. And so it was interesting that the K through 2 were much more willing to fail and try again than maybe my 5th, 6th, 7th grade students. And so I was like, okay, so how do we get that? And so that's where kind of STEM started to come up with this was this idea of creating a safe space for failure and mistakes to learn from.
Yeah. And how do you see the evolution of that? Is it a growing wave? Are teachers still a little resistant? How do you feel it's evolving?
I definitely think it is a growing wave. I think that there may be a disconnect with a lot of pedagogy because if you think of most public school settings, there are standardized tests and there's curriculum that may be a little bit more rigid. And so I do think that teachers are really interested in it, but wrestling with how does this fit into a more rigid teacher directed alternative. And even in Omaha, there's some schools popping up, public schools that have adopted education that is more STEM focused. So I think there is a wave, but there might be some struggle with like, how do we get this into the classroom in a productive way that also reflects the standardized tests that we all have to do? And so I think there's a heart and a passion for it and more people wrestling with how does this fit into our curriculum?
You talked a little bit about how you scaffold and you kind of structure that. Are there any resources, plans, specific activities that you use in your classroom to really help students be more comfortable? And then I'd like you to talk about, is there a personal story, something that just makes you smile and says, yes, this is really happening and working?
Yeah, I think social media is actually so you can follow me at the STEM Techie if you would like, but there are some incredible moms, teachers, nonprofits, companies who are really pushing that narrative of we're going to give free resources to teachers and even parents who are looking for activities over the summer or breaks or after school. So social media has been really interesting to see. Podcasts are another great episodes on there. There's a podcast, I believe it's called, I'm going to look it up so I don't butcher it because I'd love to give her a shout out. It's by Kristen Day. I believe it's called Play Based Learning. Um, Let me double check that. Yes, the Play Based Learning podcast by Kristen Day. So she's again breaking down, everybody or anyone that you talk to who is interested in education is going to say, yeah, let's have kids playing. But then we have to sit with how does this make sense and where does this fit in our curriculum? And so she's got some really great resources just in different environments and also just different tools and toys. And I often tell my kids, your toys are your tools. That's how you're learning. And so just providing different activities and resources for your kids through toys like magnetic tiles are a great resource. Snap circuits are a great resource. Building blocks are a great resource. But I do want to caution, there are so many resources out there and there's so many podcasts out there and there's so many incredible teachers out there that it can almost feel overwhelming as a parent and a teacher to say, well, if I'm not doing this, then I'm failing, in STEM. And the reality is, when you boil STEM down to the beauty that it is, it's all about space to create. And so even if you don't have, this curriculum or this activity that I'm doing on my social media platform, that doesn't mean that you can't create meaningful experiences because the benefit of STEM and play is the space to for kids to rationalize what's happening. And that can be done with toilet paper rolls. Those are a staple in my house. Toothpicks are a
Yeah,
staple
right.
in my house and my classroom. And so I would love to encourage anyone, just you don't have to have all of the right tools or the right podcasts, but you can start and you can really see the power of STEM with anything.
That's fantastic, and a perfect segue. This whole episode is really talking about how mistakes power learning in such a
Hmm.
fantastic way, but then also straight up the power of play, right? So let's
Yeah.
talk about that, and it's not something you always immediately associate right off the top of your head
Mhm.
with STEM, but you talk a little bit about what does play look like in that STEM learning environment for you?
Yeah. So I think before we go into what does play look like, I think that we need to identify what play is and what learning traditionally looked like. And so I'm a millennial and learning for me felt very rigid and it was very teacher driven, it was very test driven. And so that is often the foundation of what learning actually is or what some people think learning is. And so this whole idea of play most people think about, little kids. Tinkering is the word that I love. They're just kind of like poking around, making sense of it. And in reality, they are building the same skills as the traditional like learning. So it's not necessarily different, but it is a different type of like teaching. So play is not just unstructured time. You're really focusing on building those skills. And so, that's where resources for parents and teachers to come in, like snap circuits, like magnetic tiles, like building blocks. They're building those critical thinking skills and thinking creatively in the same breath as they're just playing with toys, right? And so this idea of unstructured feels unsafe for a lot of teaching is something that we really have to reflect on. Like, what are the skills that we're trying to convey to our students? And so if we're looking at lifelong learning, critical thinking, thinking creatively, problem solving, those are all really important skills for lifelong learning. And I think one of the most powerful pieces of this is when kids are playing, they're bringing in their background experience. They're bringing in their known knowledge about what they've already made sense. And sometimes that's misconceptions that educators and parents can come in and address, but really they're making sense of all of it. And so when my daughter was playing with magnetic tiles, she would say, Mom, this shape is the same as this shape, or this shape has this size, same number of sides. And so she's making sense of triangles and, that a circle can be broken up into four different pieces, all the while just playing. And so she's making all of those little connections. And I'm just sitting there. I'm not just sitting there, but the idea of giving them space. And so when we talk about play versus STEM, I think they are the same thing, just rebranded in a way that, we have to tie it to curriculum. But really, when you boil STEM down, it's the space for kids to rationalize what's going on and bring in their creativity. And so it's not that STEM enhances creativity, it's just giving a space for creativity to flourish. And I have been absolutely blown away time and time and time again of how creative kids are. And even when I do this with my teacher educators, how creative. I come into this activity, aligned to this standard and aligned to this standard. And every single time I am blown away at their background knowledge. So they'll bring in, if we're talking about fractions, they'll tie into other different concepts of math. And when you talk about learning, lifelong learning, the more connections that you can make with content, the bigger those synapses are going to be. Those neural pathways that are happening in the brain, they're just going to explode and they're going to get bigger. And so you're like, perfect, this is great. And so I, have just seen such power in bringing in student background knowledge into the concepts. And so whenever I have an idea, they're constantly evolving. And I think that's also the beauty of most STEM is it's focused on iterations. And so it's less about getting to the right answer and more about the process of wrestling with it, trying, problem solving. And so that is play, right? Like, so if my kid is building a tower and it falls down, she has to redo it. And so it's those iterations that are happening. Or with snap circuits, I taught with snap circuits in eighth grade. We were doing electrical currents. And so closing the circuit was really important, right, for it to function. And so just being able to tinker and play and bring in, okay, wait a second, it works with this one or it doesn't work with this one. And so how does that make sense can be really powerful. And I think the most powerful experience that I've had, there's been a lot, but the one that's just like really ingrained in my brain, I was working with some students and I had a student who was very high achieving, but struggled with anxiety and really was frustrated if they got a wrong answer on an assessment. And, if they didn't have 100% in my class, it was just really hard for them. And so naturally, someone who strives for the correct answer might struggle with STEM because there is no right answer. And that was very uncomfortable for the student. And so it was more of this like coaching and conversations that were happening in there. And the powerful moment was when we were doing penny boats. And so we were looking at buoyancy and, doing a STEM activity with that. And theirs failed, which is everybody's failed the first time around because, it generally does, right? Like 99% of the time. And I watched that student kind of collect themselves and pick up the boat and try again. And that to me was so impactful because this whole idea of we're all going to fail because to err is to human, right? And so this idea of like being okay making a mistake was so impactful for me as a teacher because, teaching mirrors learning. And so as a teacher, I wanted to be the greatest teacher and everyone loved me and I wanted to get all of the STEM activities correct. And it was just so impactful because I was like, oh, I don't have to have it all together because I'm also an iterative process. Like I'm trying to be a better teacher and trying to implement different things. But I realized in that moment that I wasn't necessarily modeling being able to make a mistake and pick myself up. And so it was like, it was this beautiful moment with the student being able to do it. And then it was also reflective in the sense of, no, we all make mistakes. And that's beautiful. And that's part of the messy learning process that is exploring and learning new things.
Yeah, part of being human in that journey and
Yeah.
developing 100%.
Yeah.
What a great story. Thanks for sharing that. You talked a little bit about how you bring it to life, and how do you coach educators in designing lessons that really help bring play and getting it wrong, kind of connecting these dots of the two and bringing them to life? How do you see it coming out?
Yeah. So most of my experience has been with public school teachers. And so they are bound by curriculum. And so we generally start with curriculum and see, okay, so what are the pacing guides saying? What do we have to tie standards to? And one common thing that I hear from educators, because it does take a little bit longer than, the traditional in education, it's called the I do, you do, we do. So it's like the teacher teaches a concept and then the students practice on it in class and then they go home. So it's I do, we do, you do, but it's actually just flipping it. So it's not adding more to your curriculum, but it's actually just flipping. And so anytime that you can create exploration or even just space to make sense of it is going to be extremely powerful. And so, whether you start that with a bell ringer or you try a whole lesson if you want to, or even just like in a free space, if you have some like study halls that are more guided, that's a great resource just to try this. And so, you can actually flip the entire thing into the you do, we do, and then I do. So it's creating space for kids to bring in their background knowledge. So instead of giving them the formula, you could give them a story problem and you could say, figure out what kind of formula works for this. And so then that's when they kind of bring in all of that. So it doesn't have to be these big STEM engineering design. There's actually like a whole range of different what STEM is. But when you boil it down, we're looking for iteration. We're bringing student understanding into it. We're creating space for them to collaborate and to think for themselves. That's really what STEM is. And so when we look at curriculum, we look for opportunities for students to start making sense of it rather than being told. And so you can do that as little as flipping it in bell ringers. You could go into these big STEM engineering design concepts. Another powerful thing you can look at, it kind of depends on the school district because some don't teach science every day and some don't teach science all year long. And so in Nebraska elementary schools, it does it a little bit differently. That they do science for 6 weeks. However, if you look at an activity that you have in math class and you're like, hold on, this could tie directly into science, then you can start infusing it into that curriculum as well. And so, what I encourage teachers to do is just look for opportunities for exploration. So, when can I step back? When can I let kids take ownership or wrestle with this? And that really comes down to in education, there's a fancy term called productive struggle. So, productive struggle is where you get your kids out of their comfort zone and you give them a challenging problem. And that is where the expertise of the teacher comes in. And they're experts because they know their curriculum, they know their students. And so, looking at where can I push them to start making sense of this, wherever it makes sense in your curriculum. And, Nebraska is rural and urban. And so that's going to look different in every school district, but just looking for opportunities to infuse that while also I would really recommend scaffolding. And so starting small and then, working towards bigger projects that are collaborative based can be really powerful.
Wonderful. That's great. Dr. Amy, can you actually, let's zoom out for a second for when we think of everything you just talked about.
Mhm.
when we think about this long-term impact, we think about the need for scientists, engineers, builders of the future, power needs, everything. Can you talk about how this approach and how you think this is really going to help maybe accelerate a love of learning, a curiosity, creativity in developing more scientists, engineers, and innovators?
Yeah. Well, first and foremost, in my experience, and I can only speak from my experience, I think kids just like STEM concepts better. So they have a more enjoyable time in class when they understand the importance of iteration and failure and the power of mistakes. And so when we're just talking about the human being, I'm like, yeah, I would love for them to like science or like math. And so maybe pursue that. That would be great. But also, I think it needs to be talked about because AI is rampant at this point. And so when we talk about the need for creativity and the need for problem solving and critical thinking, AI has all of the in the box thinking, right? So if you type in ChatGPT and say, I want a STEM experience, they can give you an in the box thinking. However, that might not be the most beneficial for your students. And so you bringing in that human experience and your background knowledge is going to be really impactful as we move forward as this like song and dance with AI comes in, that we need that real time problem solving, critical thinking, and bringing in human experience to make those decisions can be really powerful when we think about, innovations that come in the future with math and science and technology.
Yeah, I'm so happy you touched a little bit upon AI, right? I could have an AI section in every single discussion, every single podcast, right? It's just fascinating. It's evolving so quickly, and there's so much to talk about. And maybe that's a separate episode, Dr. Amy, of talking about how do you even start to entertain the idea of educating very young students around the concept of AI and things like that. It's exciting and scary and weird all at the same time right now, anyway.
Exactly.
Yeah, yeah, for sure. So this is great. So you're not only a teacher and an educator, but you're also a parent. And is there any advice or any thoughts that you give your parents to support this mindset at home with their children?
Less is more. I think that being strategic, it can be really powerful, both in the toys that you bring into your house. And I think that our society is looking for hacks. So we're like, more, 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 more. I'm going to get all of these activities for my kid and I'm going to have this structured idea of what it is. And again, this is just my experience, but I was that parent, which is fine and beautiful and great and part of my journey. And then my daughter started being like, no, back up. I've got this. And I said, okay, we'll try it. I don't know how to do this, but I, I will love this. And it has been such an incredible experience to watch her creativity just blossom. And, when we do rest times and she goes into her room with a box and some lizards, and I walk in and she's got this whole play frame and structure built and just as really cool experiences that I just started backing up a little bit more and watching her blossom in that. And now she's bringing in her younger sister as she's kind of getting into that play frame. I just think that when we're trying to entertain kids, which is not inherently bad, we can take some of that creativity time away from them. And so that may look like, once a week on Fridays, we're going to have we call it free space time. And so they can do whatever they want. I put out a bunch of resources. They can create however they want. But just like failing is a skill, I think playing independently and bringing their background knowledge is something that needs to be fostered. And so if I could encourage you to do anything, it's just let them play, which is really hard to do as a millennial who's, I was very structured in school. And so I was like, oh, even as a STEM educator for this many years, it translates differently in parenting. And so just reflecting on what opportunities am I giving my kids to just be, to play, whether it be outside in a park or, you know, with magnetic tiles or building blocks or snap circuits. We're just getting to that part and I'm so excited. My kiddo's getting big enough to do snap circuits because me and my husband love them. So we're like, let's go. Yeah, so sorry. I didn't actually. Yeah, we just genuinely love your products.
No, that's fun. That's really kind. That's so fun. So this has been so great. Is there a last thought you want to leave us with? I really think just what you've talked about will be so valued. It's so fresh and insightful.
Yeah.
So thank you, Amy. Any final
Yeah.
thoughts?
One final thought would be you're doing a great job. Everybody listening to this podcast, there is no hack. There is no podcast that you can listen to that's going to save you. We are all in iterations. That includes parenting and teaching. And I think the beauty of STEM what has taught me that it's iterations. We're doing a great job, and we can, if we quote unquote fail, we can pick back up and try again in a different way. And that can springboard us into a new understanding and a new lens. And that has been something that I've been very grateful for STEM and just this idea of play, because it's given me a piece of I don't have to have this all figured out as a teacher or a parent. We're all just out here winging it.
Yeah.
So if I can give you any advice, you're doing a great job.
Oh, Dr. Amy, you're the best. I think, we've talked a few times, obviously, but like just your energy, your perspective, and your obvious passion for bringing this to life. Just a huge thank you. And a thank you to everyone out there that's like you.
Thank you so much for having me.
No, it's the best. And I can't believe how quick like a half hour goes. It's amazing
Yeah.
when you're talking and having fun. But that's
Yeah.
it for today's episode. And Amy, a huge
Yeah.
thank you for sharing your
Of
insights
course.
and your
Yes. Oh my
stories. And like always, if you enjoyed this conversation, don't forget to subscribe. And if you're feeling super generous, leave a quick review. It helps with the fancy algorithm. And thank you again. So I'm Tim Conlin, and this is Wired for STEM. Take care.